Next, from Springfield, State Senator Andy Manar speaks at a luncheon hosted by the State University's Annuitants Association and talks about the budget impasse from the perspective of Senate Democrats. This runs about 35 minutes.
Well, thank you, Linda. Good, is it morning or afternoon? It's afternoon. Good afternoon. I appreciate Linda's invitation to speak with you for a few minutes today. If you're not from the 48th Senate District, welcome to the 48th Senate District, where you find yourselves today eating lunch. As Linda said, I was elected to the State Senate back in 2012. I represent a pretty good chunk of Springfield, most of the city of Decatur, all of the counties, all the way down to Edwardsville, though not Edwardsville proper, but pretty close. So it's a diverse set of communities, a diverse set of constituents that I represent. It's one of those crazy things called a swing Senate district. It could elect either a Democrat or a Republican on its face. In my opinion, there should be more of those, not less of those. I think that would help solve many of the problems that we face today in not just Illinois, but in our country, and all of the political discourse that we're being put through today on all levels of government. But enough of that. I want to thank you for your organization's advocacy in the Capitol building. Linda asked me to talk about the attack on public education for a few minutes today. Without your organization, things would be very different. So thank you for what you do individually and collectively as a group. And I want to thank your team as well, Linda and John and others that advocate on your behalf in the state capitol in what is undoubtedly a very difficult time in the state of Illinois. And it's going to be difficult for, I believe, for many fiscal years to come. So I want to start with a story. By the way, when I was trying to collect my thoughts on this, this is a lot of turf to cover because we've gone down what I think is a very dangerous path in recent years from as far as a perspective as privatizing public services, which is happening more and more, not just in Illinois, but across the country, to what is undoubtedly a full-throated assault on public pension systems, all the way over to the fiscal crisis that we face in the state. So that's a lot of turf to cover. And Linda also threw in Senate Bill 1, which, by the way, has passed both chambers and is now awaiting the governor's action. So I'm going to try to hit on each of those just for a few minutes, and then I'd be happy to take any questions and have a discussion with you this morning. But first, a story which I like to tell because A, it's true, this really happened to me, and B, it frames my view of so many things that deal with public education. So the summer of 2012, I was running for the state Senate, and if you remember that summer in 2012, it was hot. It was really hot. I think we went, in this area, we went, I think it was 4 or 5 weeks without rain. There was a good 2 weeks of 100+ degree weather. When you're a candidate for the state Senate for the first time in an open Senate seat in downstate Illinois, what you do is you knock on every door that you can find. And that's what I found myself doing through that stretch of heat. So I was in a community of Mount Olive, which is a little bit further south, closer to St. Louis than it is Springfield on Interstate 55, old coal mining community. Mother Jones is buried in Mount Olive. I was knocking on doors, and I was walking down the street by myself. I had a list of voters that I was supposed to talk to, and I left that list of voters in my car, which was about a half a mile away. And so I just decided to do what any candidate should never do, which is just knock on every door and try to remember who I talked to. So I started to approach what was a small one-story apartment building. I think it had 3 units in it. It was, by the looks of it, subsidized housing, subsidized apartments. And I started to walk up to this door, and I heard a rumble of thunder in the background. And now, it hadn't rained for weeks, and I thought to myself, should I walk back to my car, or should I risk getting wet? Knowing it had rained, I thought, well, I'll risk getting wet because it's not going to rain. And I took 10 steps to the front door of this apartment unit, and it started to pour. And I knocked on the door. And the door opened, and there was an elderly woman standing in front of me. And as I was getting soaked in the rain, this elderly woman said to me, "Andy, I've been waiting for you to knock on my door." Now, when you're a candidate running for office, you get a lot of things said to you. That is not one of them, right? And so I paused. And it took me about 30 seconds to realize that I was looking at my kindergarten teacher. Yeah. Mrs. Brines, who I hadn't seen in, I don't know how long, forever. She looked the same, by the way. She still does today. And so, by happenstance, it was raining, and she invited me in, and I sat in her living room for about a good half hour while it was raining, and she took me through her finances and what she pays for her health insurance and what she receives from her pension for teaching kindergarten students for years and years and years. And I don't have to explain to anybody in this room what the dynamics of that conversation were. But everything that comes in front of me as a state senator today in the state Senate goes through the prism of that conversation that I had with Mrs. Brines that hot day in July of 2012 in her maybe 4-room apartment, 3-room apartment in Mount Olive, who taught kids for a career. And so when people come up to me and say Mrs. Brines is unaffordable, that her pension's unaffordable, that her health care is unaffordable, I respectfully disagree with them. That's at the root of the division today down the street in the Capitol building on so many issues, whether it deals with how do we fund our obligations to the public pension systems, to how do we fund health care for retirees and current employees of state government and higher education, our university and community college systems, to how do we grapple with these things in a very difficult fiscal environment, and all the way to why we shouldn't privatize public education, in my opinion. All of those things go through that conversation, that filter of a conversation that I had with Mrs. Brines that afternoon. So I want to talk briefly about where we are and where I think we're going to go in the next 10 days. That's probably going to be the more brief part of my discussion with you this afternoon. And I want to preface what I'm going to tell you is simply that I don't consider myself an overly partisan person, but what I'm going to tell you may sound overly partisan. But I'm to the point with this budget disagreement that we're having now, going on several years, where I've learned to be very blunt with people and to give you my honest assessment about what's happening and what I see with my own eyes and report that to you. And you can take it for however you want. You can agree with me, you can disagree with me. What I'm trying to say is I'm just giving you my honest assessment about what's happening right now in the legislature and in state government. So first of all, it's been 1 year, 11 months, and 21 days since we've had a functional budget in place. So we're coming up on 2 years, on July the 1st. We've had stopgap measures in between. We've had 6-month budgets that excluded higher education in between. We've had these Band-Aids and pieces of duct tape that have been put on this situation time and again over the past near 2 years. But it's been 1 year, 11 months, and 21 days this morning. Number two, we're on the hook for $800 million in late penalties and interest payments to vendors, $800 million today. That's not small change. That number gets bigger to the tune of $11 million every single day that this budget impasse continues. So by the time you go to bed tonight versus the time you woke up this morning, we will have added collectively as a state $11 million to that $800 million figure. Well over 1,000 college students didn't return for a second semester in 2016 because of the specific reason of the uncertainty of the MAP grant program. For that reason. That's 1,000 college students that didn't return for a second semester. Now, let's figure out what happened to those students. I think you all know. Some of them will be lost forever. They exited higher education. They will never come back, or they'll come back years later when they ran out of choices in whatever path they chose to take. Some of those students went out of state, and they took their brain power, their future economic power as an individual, their future buying power, their kids, their future family with them, and they're not going to come back. I know some of those kids. I know them. They grew up in Bunker Hill. They're not going to be there anymore. They left the state to go to college elsewhere because of a disagreement we're having about whether or not we should fund the MAP program. Medicaid providers are owed over $2 billion today. Medicaid providers. Now, I always have to explain to constituents that what is a Medicaid provider? Well, they are employers. Many of them are small business owners that provide services that qualify for Medicaid coverage. They employ real people who have real children, who spend real money and buy real homes, real cars, real groceries, all the way down to, I was trying to think the most nominal interesting thing that's real and costs money, and I came up with a fidget spinner. They buy those too. Medicaid providers provide a lot of juice in our economy. They're owed $2 billion today. Illinois owes public schools, K through 12 schools, over $1.1 billion in reimbursements for services they provide, like busing kids, picking kids up, taking them to school. Governor Rauner often gives himself credit for having a record level of funding for K through 12 education. Record level of funding. You've heard him say it. Well, there's an asterisk next to that statement that contains two things. Number one, record level of funding in Illinois has resulted in record inequity among the haves and the have-nots. So that's number one. And the bigger piece of that asterisk is that the record level of funding has not been realized by public schools in the state because it hasn't been paid for. That's that $1.1 billion that's owed to public schools. The Senate, as Linda mentioned, has taken action beginning in January of 2017 to try to address this. It was called the Grand Bargain, and it had its starts and stops and its forward motion and backwards motion along the way, because bipartisanship is a really difficult concept for members of the legislature to grasp and to understand. That's reflected in the many starts and stops of the Grand Bargain in the Senate. But we wanted to negotiate with our counterparts in the Senate, and that's what we tried to do. The first thing we did, which is rarely talked about, but the first measure that we voted on in the Senate in January after the new General Assembly was sworn in was a rule change, which sounds way too obscure and complicated. But the Senate governs itself through rules, just like any organization, just like you, just like any organization. And we adopted a rule in the Senate that would limit the leadership to term limits in the state Senate, both the Senate president and the minority leader. That was the first thing that we did in the Senate. And we did that right out of the gate to set a tone to say that we want to change how we're doing things. Along the way, we passed many important measures, some of which the governor was demanding, others of which Governor Rauner asked for, but didn't quite give us the details on what exactly he meant, so we made our own attempt. For example, consolidation of local governments. We have the most units of local governments in the country, and we need fewer. So we passed a measure in the Senate that we think would help address that. We passed workers' compensation reform. Not the bill that the governor asked for on any particular day, but one that undoubtedly would save employers tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars over the next few years. That was a negotiated bill that took hours and hours of negotiation. That bill is sitting on the governor's desk today. We sought to balance the budget and implement school funding reform at the same time, which back in January we were told was nearly impossible. You can't reform school funding in Illinois, which is the third rail of Illinois politics. Kent has used that term many times. And balance the budget at the same time. That's too much. Too heavy of a lift, can't be done. Well, we did that on May 23rd. And we passed not only school funding reform, but we passed a balanced budget. That balanced budget contains $3 billion in cuts, difficult cuts, many of which the governor suggested in his budget address on February 15th. It also includes revenue, which is intended to balance the cuts and acknowledge that we have to address that issue in order to have a sustainable budget for the state of Illinois, not just in this coming fiscal year, but for years to come. That was not an easy vote either. At the same time, we said that we acknowledge that Bruce Rauner is the chief executive of the state and was elected by the people of the state, and he put a number on spending of $37.3 billion. In his budget request, I was going to say suggestion, but it was a request, he said spend $37.3 billion. He didn't say how to pay for it, but he said that's what you ought to spend. That's what we spent in the Senate budget, was $37.3 billion. But we prioritized education, higher education, and health care. Now, we had to move some pieces around, but we lived within the governor's spending limit that he suggested. We raised revenue, and we implemented cuts that we thought weren't as much of a priority as those other three things that I mentioned. That bill passed the Senate with only Democrat votes, and it's now pending in the House of Representatives. For higher education specifically, just a few seconds on this. I go back to the governor's first budget. Shortly after he was elected, he submitted a budget to the legislature that would have, I think it, all in all, it was a 60% reduction for higher education, universities, and community colleges. One after another, community college presidents, university presidents sat before our appropriations committees and said, if that budget goes into effect, we will double tuition. We will have to double tuition. We will have no other choice but to double tuition to community colleges and public universities. That's the result of what Governor Rauner suggested we do as a state. Now, the district I represent, for far too many kids, the University of Illinois, is out of reach already today. That's not a knock on the University of Illinois, by the way, but it's too expensive. The doors are closed for financial reasons, for other reasons that we haven't been able to sift through. But doubling tuition at the University of Illinois or at SIU or ISU or any public institution in the state is not going to bode well for middle-class families or for our state's economy. That was a root that was put into the ground that is now a full-fledged fight between many of us in the legislature and Governor Rauner on how to prioritize higher education funding. That was the first root that was put into the ground. And that tree of discord is still growing down the street because we have a fundamental disagreement about the role of public education and specifically higher education in the state budget. That's at the root of one of our many problems that we face with the Rauner administration. Now, you know, along the way, we've tried to pass bills that appropriate money for higher ed. Most recently, the Senate passed a bill that would pay for what we appropriated. But all throughout this struggle, the governor's pretty much gotten what he asked for without action of the legislature. If you look at his first budget, and what it prescribed and what it suggested, what he proposed, it's essentially what is taking place today. So one way or the other, and people like me who take this responsibility very seriously, I ask myself the question, where you get up every day and you fight these battles, and you try to do the right thing, and you take difficult votes for revenue and cuts that on a normal day you wouldn't vote for, and you try to put forward agreements or bipartisan agreements that only become partisan, and at the end of the day, the governor's getting what he asked for, which is essentially a 50% cut to higher education. So that's where advocacy comes in. And this is how we got Senate Bill 1 passed finally out of the legislature. Your advocacy is absolutely imperative to the work that we're trying to do, regardless of which side of the aisle you're on. Your advocacy is absolutely imperative. Your voice as an individual to your state senator and your state representative, your voice collectively through this organization is an absolute imperative part of ending this fiscal crisis in the state. Because inaction has afforded the governor a victory in that his first budget for higher education is literally being implemented without action. So inaction is action in the eyes of Governor Rauner. And just look at the numbers. So that's where advocacy has to keep going. And I know it's going in ways that it's never gone before in the state, but it's got to get bigger. It's got to get louder. You have to make people in elective positions feel uncomfortable. That's okay. That's okay. That's part of the job, and it has to happen. Senate Bill 1, real quick. This has been a labor of love for me for many years. This one too was a result of a meeting I had with my superintendents after the election, before I got sworn in. We got as far as we've gotten with that bill, which the advocacy for this began long before I ever got to the legislature. People who served in the House and the Senate long before I was elected had laid the foundation for the passage of this bill the last week of May. But it was because of grassroots advocacy. It wasn't a top-down conversation. It wasn't because one member of the Senate proposed a bill. That has to happen. But what hadn't happened to date was the advocacy on a grassroots level from communities large and small, representing all different types of people, urban neighborhoods, small towns in downstate Illinois, suburban communities that are struggling under the least equitable system of school funding in the country. It was that advocacy that changed the dynamic in the legislature. That bill is soon to be sitting on the governor's desk, and we've asked him to hit the pause button and not have a political conversation about that bill, and have a conversation that's based in fact and reality, which is a challenge these days, frankly. So it's a once-in-a-lifetime chance in Illinois. I'll give you one metric, and then I'm going to stop, because I could do a seminar on this one. If you look at Illinois, in terms of how much money is spent on students that live in poverty versus students that do not live in poverty. So the most progressive state on this metric, students in poverty versus students not in poverty, is Ohio. So Ohio's over here, believe it or not. So for every dollar that is spent on a student that does not live in poverty in Ohio, the state of Ohio spends $1.22 for a student that lives in poverty. So $1 non-poverty, $1.22 poverty. That's Ohio. Then there's 48 other states on that spectrum from high to low, and then there's Illinois. So why is this one important? And you know this from the work that you do in higher education. The path out of poverty is education. That is the path that is the only path out of poverty, is strong public education from preschool all the way through college or trade school. That makes someone competitive in the economy. That's the path out of poverty. So we also know that you can get the same outcome in high school of a student that lives in poverty who's only known poverty his or her entire life, versus one that doesn't live in poverty, if you just spend a little more money on the student that lives in poverty in the right way, which is the evidence-based model that Linda suggested. So we know we can get the same outcome. It just takes a little more for that student that lives in poverty. So $1.22 in Ohio, Illinois is 81 cents. So for every dollar we spend on a non-poverty student, we spend 81 cents on a student that lives in poverty, which is opposite of what we ought to be doing. That's the nature of I use the word rotten. That's what I mean. Our system's rotten. So Senate Bill 1 that came about because of advocacy would just take that and turn it on its head. And it would require that the money be prioritized, new money going forward. That's the compromise. Be prioritized to school districts that educate students that have poverty in their lives. It's that simple. And that took us decades to get to the point that we got to on May 31st. Advocacy does work, though, and that's how we're going to solve these problems, and that's how we're going to push back on issues that affect your lives, whether it's protecting pensions to asking just basic questions about privatizing public education, to making sure that we have a budget that's balanced on paper and that's balanced in priority. So again, Linda, thank you for the invitation to come speak. I hope I didn't go on too long. I'll be happy to take any questions that you have.
Does anybody have questions?
Hi, Andy.
Yep.
Marie Dawson,
Hi, Marie.
Illinois State University. Still working. Don't know when I'm going to retire, but it may be soon. Where's the increase in revenue? And because actually his first week in the office, he cut or let sunset the income tax increase. And that was very close to what the deficit would be. So where's the other income coming from? Casinos? Business? More taxes?
Yeah. Well, yeah, the question is where's the revenue come from? Or I'll tell you where I think it should come from. I'll tell you what the Senate passed, which was the result of our caucus working on this with the Republicans in the Senate. Let me back up, though. A couple of numbers that are important. Under Governor Quinn, the unpaid bill backlog reached, I believe, a peak of about $9 billion. When Governor Rauner put his hand on the Bible and took the oath of office, it was down as far as about a little bit low, $2 billion, somewhere around there, which is sounds like a lot, but that's where it functionally should be. Okay, the time frame, $2 billion out of a $35 billion budget. Okay, that's 60 days. So it went from 9 to 2. Now it's back up we're up at what, 15 now. If we do nothing, by the way, if you talk to someone who says, well, this is too difficult to solve, we got to wait until after the next election, well, you should warn them that on election day in 2018, there's going to be $24 billion of unpaid bills sitting at the comptroller's office, because without a budget, there's an absence of control. There's money going out the door at a clip we've never seen before in history of the state. So the lack of a budget doesn't mean that money isn't being spent, except with the exception of a few things, higher education being one of them. It means that there's no controls over it. So back to your question, here's what we did in the Senate. We debated things like the sugary drink tax. Didn't fly. We debated whether or not we should remove the exemption of the income tax on retirement income. Didn't fly. We had any number of things, from a full-throated service, sales tax on services like every state around us does, all the way to, well, you've read them. You've read the things that we debated. Here's what we did. We did a partial reinstatement of the income tax rate back to what it was prior to Governor Rauner taking office. We removed some exemptions in the tax code that other states have removed that don't produce direct job growth and economic growth in the state. That was several $100 million. We apply the sales tax to a very limited number of services that I would describe as politically palatable. It's about $100 million. We also have some parity on things like satellite TV and cable, where one sector of that economic sector is paying the tax the other isn't. We try to level those things out. We remove some exemptions for individuals who make over $500,000 of net income. For example, everybody gets a property tax credit to their income taxes for the property taxes. We means test that. We means test all kinds of things for those credits. So all in all, that raises it was just shy of $6 billion to help bring balance to the state budget. That has been criticized as too much. It has been criticized as not enough, which tells me it's probably pretty close to what it needs to be. Yes, sir.
I'm John Lowe from Governor's State.
Hi, John.
University. I currently live in Ohio, so it's good to hear that we're doing that. We do have a Republican governor who's been openly in opposition with Donald Trump, so
Yep.
maybe that's one of the reasons we're doing what we're doing. Well, what I ask you is, what's your best prediction for what's going to happen with our retirement system?
So I would predict that there will be very few, if any, changes for current retirees at the end of the day. And you know that if there are changes that make their way through the legislative process and get signed into law for current retirees, that those will be challenged in court. You know that, as they should be, in my opinion. So I would predict very few, if any. You've seen those proposals dwindle down, from being many to very narrow today. I think what the focus will be is going to be specifically on a third tier for employees who have not been hired yet. And there seems to be some fairly unified support among both political parties on that concept. That's where I think the focus is going to be. And there's one, this is not with respect to higher education, but there's one tremendous pause button that has to be hit on that, in my opinion. The savings that are realized in the state budget are substantially for community colleges, and so in ICCB's budget, SERS, and TRS for K through 12, because in addition to benefit changes, which by the way have to be changed for TRS, because I personally think Tier 2 TRS is illegal, because participants are paying more in than they're ever going to get out. That's a fact. So here's the pause button. The pause button is that the cost of Tier 3 is going to be shifted to community college budgets and public school district budgets, which is a savings to the state budget, which should not just be lost in the shuffle. It should be reinvested, public education, but those costs have to be borne by someone. And that has to be fully debated, has not been debated to date. Yeah, there's pros and cons to that, by the way, but has not been debated yet.
Can we give a round of applause?
Thank you.